Okay, so maybe we can start now. And so, hi everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Phinance Online seminars. And I would like to thank you for attending this seminar. And in this meeting, we will discuss the Daniel last book, Taking the Floor: Models, Morals, Management in a Wall Street Trading Room, published by Princeton University Press. And of course, I would like to thank you, Daniel, and all the discussants for accepting our invitation. And of course, I'm very, very happy to present this exciting, very interesting book here at the Phinance Online seminars. And before starting, I want to remind you of the format of the seminar. So Daniel will talk for about 20 minutes, and then, as usual, the discussant will have a maximum of 12 minutes each for the comments. And then finally, we will open the debate where everybody can ask questions you can do it in two ways, as you know. You can ask your questions in the chat or better, directly in the video by raising your hand in the reaction menu of Zoom. So I think it's time to start, and I pass the word to Daniel, who I thank again for being here. So thank you very much, Daniel.
Well, many thanks, Emiliano, for the invitation, and to all the panelists for being here, as well as to those friendly faces in the audience, and as well as those who I don't have the pleasure yet to have met. I'm very lucky to have such eminent scholars as discussants to comment on the book. And I'd like to take a couple of minutes to thank some of the people that were particularly important for the development of the book. And chief among them is David Stark, my co-author in various papers, mentor, friend, took a bet on a young Spanish PhD student back in 1999. Donald, of course, was here. He has not only supported the book at critical junctures, but also turned Edinburgh into the home of the social studies of finance community over the past these 2 decades. And I'm thankful for that. And I also wanted to mention some of the, at the time, PhD students, now many of them chair professors, who made up the network of the social studies of finance. Yuval Milo, Fabian Muñeza, Fabian Lepine, Martha Poon, and others, and our workshops and the work on the blog Socializing Finance has contributed enormously to make this time special. And so in the time that I have, I'm going to give a quick summary of the book and then consider how it speaks to some debates. But it's really the discussants' contributions that I am very much looking for today. So Taking the Floor is essentially the story of an experiment. Back in the mid-1990s, a senior manager at a large Wall Street bank, whom I will call Bob, became frustrated with the repeated scandals in derivatives trading, OTC, over-the-counter derivatives at his bank. And when he took on a new position in the late 90s at a different bank, he decided to redesign the trading floor so as to avoid any more scandals. So the book, to put it simply, is the story of that experiment, which lasted exactly 7 years as Bob resigned from his position in 2004. So what did Bob actually do? What was the outcome of that experiment? And what do we learn from it for current debates about reforming the financial sector? That's the point of the book. The core lesson from that experiment, which I will call proximate control, is a solution to a problem. But let me go first into what the problem that Bob was confronting was. And that was a situation where the use of economic models, and specifically value at risk models, which were being used to restrain the traders, were creating a perception of injustice, leading to something similar to what social psychologist Albert Bandura has called moral disengagement. To put it in a very sort of like down-to-earth term, he had led to a situation where the traders no longer felt bad when they were going against even their own norms. They had become disengaged and they had become unrestrained by their own moral constraints. So that was the problem that Bob had encountered in the mid-1990s. The solution that he came up with was to hand control back to the managers and to rely on the cultural and structural management handbook that one should be able to find in any business school, even though it's actually hard to find it these days because interest by faculty has often turned to other dynamics. And so the use of charisma, the use of social norms, direct engagement with the traders, promoting supporters, firing deviants, creating internal labor market structures that would favor the use of these informal norms were all put to work. But it would be a mistake to see proximate control as simply just going old school for a manager. And instead, it is best understood as undoing the problems caused by attempts at control at a distance through the use of models. So that is the core lesson of the book. But the book is also a story about a researcher, and in this case, myself. So I met Bob in November 1999. At the time, I simply wanted to study a Wall Street trading floor. In fact, any trading floor that would let me in, and there had been already a couple that had kicked me out. And I had no clue that Bob was in the midst of this very peculiar experiment of reforming his trading floor. And so I spent 4 years doing fieldwork at this bank, but my fieldwork was not aimed at this grand experiment, but rather aimed at understanding the nitty-gritty details of how material economic models and social relations came together in the practice of arbitrage. And my fieldwork went on from 1999 till 2003. And then I concluded my dissertation and I stopped doing fieldwork. During that initial time there, my core discovery was about the interplay between networks and models, something that in the book I present as performative spirals. And so when I say performative, when I say models being performative, I am using it in the same way as Donald Mackenzie has so successfully used in the past. The models were essential in the valuation of securities. And here, a particularly intriguing example that I found was the expression quilted markets. So one day I discovered the manager of the trading floor was using representations of the market as sort of like a diagram made up of tiles that would turn deep red or deep green, depending on the evolution of the market. Each block was a sector in the market. And he ended up, after watching that diagram on different days, concluding that the volatility properties of the market were different on days where they were quilted, meaning that the blocks were very clearly visible. Some sectors doing really well, others doing really bad, versus days in which the market was not quilted, meaning sectors on the whole doing similar to the rest of the market. So clearly you cannot understand what a quilted market means unless you have a quilted diagram of the market. And it's that symbiotic relationship between the model and the valuation that makes them performative. In addition to that, the models were, of course, limited in their scope of applicability. And what was particularly interesting is that the manager of the floor knew this. And he understood that these limitations could be addressed by promoting social interaction across the desks. So for instance, if the statistical properties that the statistical arbitrage desk is exploiting stop holding for stocks that enter merger conversations, being situated close to the merger arbitrage desk, which is specialized in precisely stocks that are undergoing merger conversations, can provide a very helpful guidance. And so the trading floor was designed to promote social interaction. And here I am reminded of Michael Barsolet's recent book on public management, which he sees public management as a design-oriented discipline. But what I eventually also discovered was that the shape of these informal networks changed through time over the years. And the reason for that change is that the layout of the floor itself was evolving over the years. It was strategically altered by Bob, the manager. So the networks were dynamic in nature. These alterations were not random. They followed changes in market conditions that made some models relevant and not others. And so, for instance, in an environment of high interest rates, the stock loan desk would be placed at the center of the room because tacit information about the cost of financing was very important. But in a low interest rate market environment, that same stock loan desk came pushed to the periphery of the trading floor because that tacit knowledge became less important. And so over the time, one can envision a relationship between economic models and the valuation of stocks in which there is an interdependency and a spiraling dynamic over time that I came to call performative spiral. And so taking the floor is both the story of a management experiment, but also is a form of laboratory study in the tradition of science and technology studies, and similar to, for instance, the study that Karen Norsetina conducted of high energy physics labs. Nevertheless, the book contains one final story, and that is the story of a revolution that went somewhat out of control. And that revolution was the incorporation of models, technology, and equations into financial markets. That move, which was to turn finance into a form of something that shared many properties with science, was in many ways moral in nature. So the point was to not have any more insider trading to obtain a trading edge, or to avoid irrational exuberance and excesses, and instead turn to data and models and rational decision making. But of course, that story came to a critical juncture in the global financial crisis of 2008. And in fact, the book is about this global financial crisis, but told from the standpoint of a few insiders. And in fact, the motivation for writing the book was my own struggles during the time of the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in September of 2008. Back then, I was a young assistant professor at Columbia Business School, and Lehman's bankruptcy left me in a complete state of bewilderment. And the reason for that is that the very damning headlines that were being reported by the press were so out of line with what I had seen at the bank run, at the trading floor run by Bob at International Securities. Eventually, after a month of experiencing cognitive dissonance, I understood what was going on. The experiment that I had witnessed 8 years before, meaning in 1999, was an attempt precisely at preventing a Lehman-style outcome. And so this is why International Securities looked so different from Lehman Brothers or the journalistic reports of it. And so in sum, I then understood that the trading floor I had seen and followed was not representative of other trading floors, but in fact was the opposite. It was illustrative of how a reformed Wall Street might possibly look like. And so when I understood all this, then I became very determined to write this book, go back to Bob, go back to the traders, go back to my data, and this time reanalyze it, not from the standpoint of how the models and social relations come together in arbitrage, but rather what lessons does the experiment that I had unknowingly witnessed hold for existing debates about how to reform the financial sector. And so the book then, I believe, 2 years after its publication, speaks to a number of contemporary debates that I will quickly mention here in the hope to inspire others to pursue these and similar ideas. In the terrain of finance, the debate over bank culture or how to reform the culture and ethics of Wall Street banks and banks in the City of London to avoid another crisis is particularly relevant. And here the question is what has been done, to what extent was it effective, and why has not more been done? And my sense is that it's been difficult for regulators to grapple with cultural reform. They are operating at a distance. And the steps that we're taking, a program in bank culture reform and the Federal Reserve and the creation of the Banking Standards Board have made strides, but I think that now we still are at the point where the effectiveness of what has been done needs to be understood, and an alternative paths need to be explored. Second, the threat posed beyond finance by the use of models and algorithms is now widely acknowledged, thanks partly to the very positive reception to Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, and the repeated tech scandals that we have witnessed over the past 4 years. But the solutions to the dangers and the threats posed by algorithms and social media are very much the subject of debate. And so it's no coincidence that many advocate for the breakup of Google or the breakup of Facebook, just as the informants in my book advocate for the breakup of Goldman Sachs and the breakup of Morgan Stanley. So the key lesson from taking the floor in this debate is that the real danger, as far as I saw, was the use of models, not for the purpose of valuation, but for the purpose of control, and specifically employees' resistance and moral reactions to being mismanaged by an algorithm, by a model. These days, as we move beyond the COVID pandemic, the importance of face-to-face interaction at work is much better appreciated. Yet the question of how to design spatial networks in offices to complement the digital the digital tools used by employees still remains insufficiently explored. So I think that there's great benefits to be had by looking into this. And again, the concept of performative spirals proposed in the book, I think, can be relevant to understand these dynamics. And finally, the shift to stress testing in the analysis of climate risk at institutions such as the Bank of England can be seen as an implicit acknowledgement of the limits of value at risk models in grappling with a radically uncertain future. Yet the world's largest banks are all controlled by these outdated value at risk models, and in fact grew large partly because of them. And so a debate over alternatives to the current value at risk plus megabank regime as we have now on Wall Street, and which in fact brought us the 2008 crisis, is still in its infancy, and I think that it's something that needs to be taken up. So I'll stop here. Thank you again, Emiliano and the informants, and I'm very much looking forward to hear your points.
Thank you, Daniel, very much for your talk. And now I think that we can listen to Donald, who is the first discussant. So thank you, Donald, for being here, and it's up to you now. We can't hear you, Donald.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me now? Good. Thank you for organizing this. It's a very rich book, and Daniel's given us a very nice introduction to its themes. I'm going to take a slightly different tack in my comments, thinking less about finance and considering taking the floor as a contribution to the social sciences more broadly. First of all, methodological, and then secondly, theoretical. Even, and this causes me certain nervousness in the presence of philosophers, even a contribution to the philosophy of the social sciences. So, methodologically, it's participant observation. It's superb participant observation. I really know of only two other pieces of participant observation of Phinance that compare to it. One is Caitlin Zaloom's book, Out of the Pits. The other is the work of Olivier Gaudichaud, Working Rich and Les Traders. So it's up there among the top three participant observation studies of finance. And it's worth remembering how novel Daniel's work was, because if you go back to 1999, the start of it all, as far as I can recall, there was only one existing participant observation social science study of a trading room, the work by Christian Heath, Marina Jarotka, and colleagues. Such work was rare in part because, as Daniel points out in the book, it's studying up, studying those who are more powerful than the researcher. So access, Daniel already mentioned, the two false starts before the successful one. So what Daniel could simply have done is to package together the papers that he wrote in main part in collaboration with David Stark out of that brilliant participant observation, packaged it up into a book, and that would have been that. But he didn't. And this is the methodologically interesting thing. What Daniel learned by going back to key informants and approaching it not through observational ethnography, but through what was in effect oral history. And his realization that what he had taken to be a trading floor in its natural state was actually a very deliberate construction by, above all, by the man that Daniel calls Bob. And while it looked organic, it looked non-hierarchical, it looked heterarchical, to use David Stark's term, it really wasn't. There was power and authority there. So going back with a different method led Daniel to radically different conclusions. And I think really taking the floor deserves to be a methodological classic in that respect. So the second point, theory verging almost into philosophy of social science. Like me, Daniel was very much influenced by the actor network theory of Bruno Latour, Michel Caron, Anna-Marie Moll, and many others. As I'm sure everybody taking part in this seminar knows, what's distinctive about that is its emphasis on the constitutive role of non-humans, technologies, and other non-humans in social life. And that approach very much influenced my work. It influenced Daniel's work. He paid his dues to it in the emphasis on the physical layout of the trading room, trading robots, the spread plot in merger arbitrage, and the like. But there's a strain in Daniel's work of dissatisfaction with an exclusive emphasis on this. It comes out, for example, in work that he's just briefly alluded to on the pandemic, interviewing senior bankers about working at home versus being in the office. It comes out in work he's done with Yuval Milo on the automation of trading on the New York Stock Exchange. It comes out in Taking the Floor, in a little passage at the end, if I remember correctly, it's the end of chapter 8. My conception of Bob's trading floor had neglected the role of humans and conjectured instead a trading room where objects did the heavy lifting work of coordinating people and enforcing norms. I now, and this is again the rethinking with the new approach to the materials, I now saw the inaccuracy of such a view. It was frames, norms, shared experiences, personal energy, and other managerial elements that were equally, if not primarily, responsible for the collaboration and restraint. There's, in particular, a lovely little touch in the book, which is the, I think, 3 references to the Dunbar number, which I'll explain in just one second. But why is apposite? Is that, to my mind, the best introduction to actor network theory is a paper that Bruno Latour did with the eminent primatologist Shirley Strum, who studies baboons. And Strum is an astonishing researcher. She became, in effect, an ethnographer of baboons. Baboons have very complicated little societies. Baboons are actually not that much less clever than we are. The neocortical ratio among primates, this is where Dunbar comes in, the neocortical ratio among primates is correlated with group size. It's a log linear relationship. Baboons have societies limited in time and space to the scope of face-to-face interaction. We, of course, build societies that last through time and spread through space. We build societies that have histories and geographies, but not because we are that much cleverer than baboons. Plot Homo sapiens on the graph, and you get the group size 150, which is the Dunbar number. So the actor network theory position is, of course, that we can do it because objects make it possible for us to do it. But Daniel Beunza is not entirely happy with going too far down that route. you can say in a certain sense that the actor network critique of orthodox sociology is that orthodox sociology is baboon sociology. It is writing about human society as if human society were baboon society. I've always had a certain sense that we shouldn't turn our back too much on baboon sociology. So this finally is my question to Daniel, that whether, despite always being impeccably turned out, as we can see, despite always being impeccably neat, Daniel, are you at heart really a baboon sociologist? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donald, for your comments and your very interesting question. And I'm looking forward to hear Daniel answer. And now it's time to pass the word to Catherine. And thank you very much, Catherine, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much. I think I'm representing New York City here, or the US in this contingent. So just so you all know, Daniel and I go way back. We actually first met as graduate students when we were both conducting our respective research on our organizations. And so it's really exciting to see Daniel present his body of research in so many different contexts. So like Donald, this is an impressive and excellent guide to the process of conducting ethnographic research. And in particular, I think it shows the struggles that ethnographers face, not just in the field when conducting research, but more importantly, when analyzing the research and trying to think, well, what is this a question of? What insights am I really finding? What kinds of things am I testing? So the ideas in particular, some of us would call this abductive analysis, the constant testing of theory through observation and through talking with various interlocutors. And what I found particularly fascinating was Bob's visit to Daniel's class. I've had my own, research partners come and talk in my classes as well. But I'd never thought about it in terms of a way of re-examining the data. And so I think, this being the kind of pivotal moment in Daniel's, text, I think shows is kind of the pinnacle of his impressive engagement with both organizational theory and economic sociology, where he uses Bob as an example of how, all of us who have to manage the classroom, right? Like many of us assume that, when we're teaching students or encouraging them to learn, that this is something that's, comes naturally. And Bob is an example where he pointedly tells Daniel, you have to enforce norms, you have to set up expectations, and you actually have to act upon them. It was particularly telling. I'm sure it was not necessarily a lesson that Daniel had realized he was going to witness, right? One of the other things that Daniel pulls out in his text, and I was also wondering if he would delve into this further, and this also relates back to the role of the manager in terms of communicating and enforcing norms, is the potential dangers of what many organizational psychologists would probably recognize. Richard Verhappen in particular would probably call this a group being too groupy, right? So in particular, this is the trading desk in chapter 4, the sales trading desk, where one person plays a prank in cooperation with others upon a hapless caller who thinks he's calling the DMV, but actually is calling the trading desk, which scares the caller and says you must show up at the DMV for a drug test. And I think this is the point that I am wondering about. I think Daniel's starting to, and I'm not quite sure if he wants to elaborate a bit further, of whether or not this shows what could potentially happen if norms are not enforced across an organization and unit-specific norms may develop, groups may become too groupy. And in addition, other questions arise, right? And this is also something I asked Daniel about in when I interviewed him for Org Theory about his book, about what other sectors can learn from this, right? So I read it from the perspective, this is a learning organization, not necessarily from the lens of finance. I think I'm one of the critics who's not in the financial sector here. And I think Daniel's also raised connections potentially through the tech field, for example. So as we can see with the pandemic, different sectors are in different stages of returning to what Daniel identifies as crucial in his book, face-to-face communication, right, and contact. In technology, we see that they are delaying their return to working together, working remotely. It looks like it's becoming the norm rather than the exception. Whereas in finance, my understanding is that most of the financial firms are planning to return if they have not already returned, and academia is somewhere in the middle. So I'm wondering if Daniel can extrapolate what are the applicable lessons that we can learn from finance to other kinds of learning organizations and other kind of sectors, and what are the limits? And then my final question for him concerns this return to the spatial design, where Bob has deliberately set up units to sit side by side or to intermix people every 6 months, right, changing their seating assignments. And he mentions at the very end, and I don't know if this is sort of in a response to a reviewer or not, but the mention of gender, right? So we know by design, right, organizations can promote inclusion or exclusion, and in particular, in this case that we see, right, it's designed around certain kinds of exclusion and inclusion. So in particular, there's a reference to a desk that is populated by a guild of Italian Americans from Staten Island, for example. And I think, other units are more gender segregated. So this is probably more kind of a little bit out there, but kind of projecting into the future, seeming organizations are more interested in inclusion versus exclusion as a potential way of being more durable and relevant and resilient. To what extent can organizations consider spatial designs in terms of inclusion versus exclusion? So I think, I'm not sure if I quite met my time, but I think I posed probably 3 questions for Daniel that I hope that he can start to address, or we can pick one of the 3 that most intrigued me when I was revisiting his book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for your rich token questions. And now we can, now it's time for Jose to comment on Daniel's book. So thank you, Jose, for being here today with us.
Thanks, Emiliano, and it's nice. It's very fun to be here. And so I have prepared short intervention. So let's go. There is no doubt about it. Daniel Beunza's Taking the Floor is a well and carefully written book. It is clearly argued, and the ethnographic description worked nicely. Nevertheless, this is a book that left me thinking hard about how to understand it. In this short presentation, I attempt to share my puzzle and my current attempt to answer a simple question. What does this book do? 1, the approach. As you know, and as Donald mentioned before, Daniel has been an important contributor to the social studies of finance movement. His collaboration with David Stark are some of the key texts that help to set this important and influential research agenda. Because of that, my expectation when I first heard about this book was that it will match the type of preoccupation and heuristic that characterize the social studies of finance as academic movement. The social studies of finance movement was not simply about studying the social or the cultural in finance, as for instance, in the earlier new economic sociology movement. In fact, it was openly anti-social. Inspired by actor network theory, the basic heuristic was pay attention to the technical, the device, expertise, knowledge. The social, the cultural, norms, moral, etc., do not explain. The explanation is in its socio-technical networks. Well, this is how the book is described in the cover. Debates about financial reform led to the recognition that a healthy financial system doesn't depend solely on how it is structured. Organizational culture matters as well. Based on an extensive research in a Wall Street derivative trading room, taking the floor, consider how the culture of financial organization might change in order for them to remain healthy. Close quotation mark. Taking the floor, to use a convoluted formulation, that's an inversion of the inversion. Unlike the post-ANT studies of finance, it is all about culture. As Donald said, it's a baboon sociology. If this book then is a social studies of finance, but it doesn't do the performativity device type of study, what does it do? A plausible possibility could be that this could have been a book of economic anthropology. It described a long-term ethnographic study and culture plays a central role. However, and perhaps surprisingly, the book hardly engaged with anthropology. Here, you won't find lengthy discussions of Levi-Strauss or Mary Douglas' understanding of culture. It's not a cultural anthropology book. What you will find are reference and discussion of economic sociologists' take on culture, for instance, Celicer or Kieran Haley. As a reader, however, I get the sense that Beunza knew that he had to set this book in relation to this literature, but that both he didn't engage deeply with a cultural approach in sociology. This book is the less strong, for instance, when explaining how Weber understands culture, and that this literature does not do much for his material either. I would say that even though this book engaged with it, it is not a book of cultural sociology. 2, the writing. Another way to explore the question about what this book does is if we think about its style of writing. As you know, the book describes a long-term ethnography, which surely will become an exemplary study. But there is something else. Unlike traditional ethnographies in sociology, Beunza does not study a firm, and it is not like in some of the best known studies in the social studies of finance literature, for instance, Mackenzie and Miller's work, a qualitative research of a particular financial industry. It is more than anything a study of one actor, the trading manager Beunza calls Bob. There are many other figures, both colleagues and subordinate, but Bob is surely the book's main character. This is very important. This book is not about the problem of other classical actors in the social studies of finance. It's not about traders, their particular dynamics and devices, and it is not either about the evaluation of complex financial products. It surely touches some of these issues, but it's mostly about a book about Bob's problem. And Bob is a manager. This book is an ethnography of management in finance. Through Daniel's narrative, we learn about the problems of those whose work is to find ways to better organize work, collaboration, incentives, and norms of those who work under their responsibility. Like Carlos Castaneda's Don Juan book series, Taking the Floor dramatized a master disciple story. We follow Daniel's long process of learning from Bob. More specifically, the book focused on 2 of Bob's problems. The first, which was also the issue in Beunza's earlier publication, is how to organize collaboration in order to enhance better and more creative trading. The second, which is the main issue in this book, is an ethical and moral problem, how to better manage risk and responsibilities. In short, in the context of complex financial product, customer, here large firms, cannot understand fully what is involved. They are exposed to trust their financial intermediaries. Likewise, as products become more and more complex, not even traders can fully understand the implication of the product they trade. In the industry, the common approach to deal with these issues is formalistic. It is the customer's responsibility to understand what they trade with, and financial organizations can use the procedures of formalized risk management. Bob teaches Daniel a different approach. He would prefer, for instance, to share losses with customers, and rather than merely trusting formal models of risk management, to use local precaution and judgment. In turn, what Daniel does is to conceptualize the learning from his master. The dilemma of current financial firms can be theorized as model-based moral disengagement, and a possible form of dealing with this issue is by the practice Beunza termed proximate control. 3, and final, an answer and a hypothesis. This is then a first answer to my, I know, somehow rhetorical question. What does this book do? It is an ethnography of financial management. We understand the problem of managing traders, and the case provides an examples of how some of these problems could be better dealt. But I think the book does or attempt to accomplish something else. By the end of the book, and in some of his interventions after, for instance, Daniel's apparitions in BBC's Thinking Aloud and his online exchange with Gillian Tett, something else begins to appear. The last part of the book touches on the post-LIBOR scandal context, where industry insiders started to see some of the issues with finance as cultural problems. Daniel has, in turn, actively engaged with this concern. However, he has done it in an intriguing way. It is not about telling industry insiders what sociologists understand by culture. Instead, what Beunza has done is a series of seminars to teach industry insiders how to conduct ethnography. What this says, I think, is first, that Beunza's interest is not culture as a sociological problem. It is rather the area of problematic that insiders understand as cultural problems. And second, and this is my closing hypothesis, is that this book, Taking the Floor, does not only present a successful ethnography of financial management, it dramatized also Beunza's invention of a new public persona for the ethnographer of finance. It is a type of academic practitioner that says, if you have a cultural problem, you don't need an expert in culture, you need an ethnographer. The ethnographer will not tell you what culture is, but will help you see those problems you understand as cultural that importantly affect your practice. We witnessed the emergence of this new form of academic intervention. Well, that's it. Nothing more to add besides saying thanks to Daniel for such a thought-provoking book and to Emiliano for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Jose, for your alternative viewpoint, and thank you very much for this. And now I think that we can give the word to Michael for our last discussion. So thank you, Michael, for being here.
It's a pleasure. My comments are less formal, and I'll take advantage of being in the last position to maybe pick up on some of the comments that have been stated so far, which are really interesting. I think I'd like to just underscore a few of them, and because they might be ones we take forward later on. Okay, so one is I think was stimulated by one of the early things Daniel said today, which is in some ways the subject of this book is Daniel, and not just management and finance. And I think we should take that really, really seriously. Clearly, Jose was taking that very seriously in the last comment by partly saying you can't understand this book without understanding Daniel. I mean, maybe not Daniel as a person, but Daniel as this figure that has gone through his own career in various institutional environments and various disciplinary environments. And that may actually play into our host's interests, as far as I can tell, in the philosophy of science, which is, if you want to understand how science works, try to understand how the people work who do science in their institutional environments. So I think we should. But one question might be, first of all, is that so weird? Is that completely odd? Are we going to get nothing out of that discussion? Well, I think we will get something out of the discussion also, because it's sort of in the nature of qualitative or case research that it's personal. Okay, people like Stake in particular, and Becker will make it pretty clear that this kind of work is inevitably personal. And that carries, as opposed to, well, I guess, I don't know what the contrast term is, but completely governed by disciplinary standards, disciplinary norms, disciplinary forces. So that's worth taking note of. But the implication that follows from that in these books is that the authors have to establish, well, for lack of a better term, their authority with the readership. Okay, the authority doesn't just come from the procedures and the affiliations and that are reflected in the way the work is written up. And I mean, authority, I think here we should not use too narrowly. I mean, we should say something about how it is that the reader comes to attribute meaning to what is being said, to the point that something about it is compelling. Okay, and you take it and you tell somebody else about it, like what we're doing now. And so I think one of the questions that this leaves us with is, so at the end of the day, what does this book stand for? I think this is one of the questions of identity that Jose was getting at, and what would we want to say it stands for, and for what reason, and how can we rely on the book to make those points? Right? Maybe Daniel can build on that. From my point of view, okay, this is not that far from Jose's comment. I mean, I think this is about management. Okay, one reason to think so is not just that aspects of the setting and what happens there are more easily, more readily, more aptly discussed in terms that many of us associate with bureaucratic institutions. But because Daniel brought it to me. Daniel used the book in some ways to bring management into finance and finance into management. Right? It's not the argument. And that's interesting, because I think the argument would have been hard to make explicitly. Okay, so it's somewhat of a seductive argument that, in fact, if we're interested in financial institutions, if we're interested in financial markets as collective members of humanity, we ought to be interested in management, and with a recognition that although that is a singular term, it's not a singular phenomenon. Okay, there are differences enough in setting that in finance and other settings that have become kind of a source of how we talk about this, that we may need a management of finance discipline of sorts. And that's really hard to do. And I think the fact that this book is absolutely on that point, but makes it in a seductive manner rather than an explicit manner, is something very much to hold on to and to explore further. Okay, why is it that this book is only a seductive argument about subliminal, almost, or not quite subliminal, but a seductive argument that management needs to be brought into finance, and vice versa, in a true managerial way, not just in we have to have finance in the curriculum. And one of the reasons I'm confident about saying this is that one of the things I learned most from Daniel, talking to him, he knows the story, in his office, is that he was reporting on teaching management in the Columbia Business School, and finding that the students were not at all interested in his course, and it was very tough going. And it was because they weren't interested in management. And not only were they not interested in management because their careers were not tied to management as a kind of occupation they were going to get into, as opposed to consulting and investment banking or whatever, but because the larger institution of the business school or the management school had given up on management as a subject too. I think you pretty much said that, but if I'm just adding that, and the punchline, which I carried away with me then, carried around with me as head of department and retained today is this problem is bigger than me. Where I'm speaking for Daniel, the difficulty of teaching the subject. And so maybe that's something we could discuss. I mean, is there, has Daniel suggested ways of threading the needle, of doing something different so that that we could have a conversation about management and finance? Now, I think the answer to that is yes, but I would add a few questions to Daniel about ways that he had engaged that question. So one of the terms that came up in the presentation, it's come up in some of the comments, comes up all the time in other venues, is there must be a lesson to be drawn from this study. Okay? Insofar as it is a case, there's a lesson to be drawn from the case. And well, we know where that comes from, I mean, approximately in management school context, it comes from Harvard, sort of Harvard Business School, and you ask at the end of the case discussion, what was the point of the case? What is it you're supposed to remember that the case leads you to, and that what case is supposed to be a reference to? Okay, and that comes from casuistry and other things that lie in the ancient background of the Harvard case teaching. And one of the questions would be: is that the right way to think of what we're doing with cases if we're interested in management being a serious field, not a field that is just a collection of things like organizational behavior and finance or marketing? And well, Daniel knows that I think the answer to that is no. I think we have to fundamentally rethink the management field in order to take cases and understand the intricacies of what took place and place that into a context of serious, complex argument about how to effectuate the intent of these institutions and meet larger teleological interests. And be a long discussion, but I think this points to the need for a different idea of management. There's some building blocks in the study, but most importantly, it shows that if you don't talk about management, you're not talking about anything important with respect to these institutions. So I think if the problem is bigger than Daniel, but if in time we can help him with that, that would be good. The only other specific thing I'd say in that regard is, yeah, if you look at there's a kind of dialogue going on between concepts from sociology and administration and the facts of the case, and they're really interesting to follow. But we might want to think, what is really going on there? Okay, what is? I don't think that's ethnographic. I think saying that's ethnographic doesn't quite work. Because a lot of the concepts that are being introduced into the discussion of the specifics are there because they have had a role to play in purposive theorizing about management and administration. And this is not a fault, this is a reality, okay? So one of the questions is, what are we doing when we're describing a case and bringing into the circumference of discussion ideas and concepts which have our attention because, whether we know it or not, they are archetypes. They are answers to practical questions stated in the abstract. Questions stated in the abstract like, should men marry? Not practical questions like, should Cato marry Marcia? To go back to Quintilian, right? So what are we doing when we are analyzing, talking about a case where the concepts are there because they've played a role in orienting people to practice, as opposed to concepts that we are bringing into play precisely because we think they're coming from sociology or a social science discipline and allow us to describe. And this is one of the many questions that bedevils any attempt to think seriously about management as a discipline. So I'm glad Daniel has put us on that track, and I think it will take a village to build this further. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Michael, for this new angle. So we have different questions and comments coming from very different angles, and maybe that's tell us probably how rich is the Daniel's book. And well, I don't know how would you like to proceed, Daniel? Maybe we could open the debate and then ask further questions, then you answer all the questions, or do you prefer to answer discuss some questions, then open the debate?
Perhaps, well, I should start by thanking profusely the four panelists. It's been terrific. I had never seen my work so productively scrutinized in this manner. And I think that it's an extremely generative discussion. And so what I perhaps would love to do is quickly address a few key points, not all of them, but a few key points. And then of course, open it up to Q&A. And I'm very keen to hear from those in the room and the questions that they might have. But very briefly, if I may, so Donald's question, his very generous depiction of my work, asks whether I am, at the end of the day, a baboon sociologist. And the answer that I have is that I would characterize myself, I would like to believe that I am a sociologist of the hybrid. I think that we live in a hybrid world of people and material, and it's all about the interplay. And so we hybrid is both a category, echoing Michael's point about practical constructs that then sort of spill into theoretical. So hybrid is both a theoretical concept, entities that are both material and human, but now it's also an approach to teaching in universities where some students cannot make it face-to-face and some students are there with you in the room. And I was recently witness to a situation where we had a hybrid department meeting where half of the participants were unable to participate because the hybrid system didn't quite work. And so the importance and effectiveness of understanding hybridity and how things come together became once again particularly clear to me. After the end of the meeting, I went to my head of department and explained that, in my research on the New York Stock Exchange with Yuval Milo, we saw that the New York Stock Exchange also messed up the hybrid system. And when they were forced to automate, they ended up losing 80% of their market share. So those words were barely a consolation to my head of department, but he did feel that it was very interesting that this was going on. So I would say that I think it's and Calon has also been formulated this idea of Homo economicus 2.0 in habilitation, and how, in his view, the focus when understanding markets ought to be on the interplay between the artifacts and the people. So I guess that would be where I would go. The comments done by Catherine were again extremely thought-provoking and generous. Was the group too groupy? Well, there's no question that it was too groupy, and the manager had to walk a very fine line between promoting what he saw as an efficient way of working, where people were just working with sort of like their mates and their bros, and something that adhered to contemporary values of diversity. And it's not that he got it perfect, and he did face plenty of situations where things didn't go as expected. But what I would say in terms of spatial design and the ways in which design can lead to inclusion and exclusion is that it's very clear that the demise of the large banks has played in the favor of hedge funds and alternative and private equity companies, and generally speaking, what people refer to as alternative finance. And if one is not happy with the lack of inclusiveness in large banks, you should see what the alternative looks like. And so, for a taste of it, the television series Billions about life in a hedge fund. Hedge funds are, as Neely's research has shown, an extremely patrimonial form of institution that is deeply exclusionary. So I think that paradoxically, as much as we love to hate Wall Street banks, they may be the best hope for those who are in favor of greater inclusion in the financial sector. And it's interesting that the FCA, the British regulatory entity that oversees banks, has been doing some, in my view, very interesting work in highlighting with greater clarity what are the formal reporting lines in banks. They were unclear and blurred before the financial crisis, and the FCA has developed something called the senior management regime, in which it just really clarifies reporting lines. And I think that this is a very positive step, or it looks like a positive step towards having enabling formal organizations. So one fantastic potential project for any qualitative researcher out there would be to explore the effects of the senior management regime on how these large bureaucracies that are the bank, what are the effects on those bureaucracies? Is it enhancing things? And what is the effect that it has on inclusion? To Jose's presentation, I cannot thank you enough, Jose. It is all too tempting to just be positive about the books that one sort of like comments on in a panel such as this. And so I knew that you would be provocative, and thank you for delivering. And your question to me is, I suppose, what is this book about? And why am I so much at the center of it? And here I want to be very honest and transparent. This book had not initially been written as a journey. It was nicely packaged into different themes that to me had the appearance of being more proper and conceptual. But then what happened to me one day, I was down to chapter 4 already doing this. And then one day I reread my field notes, and I realized that the field notes were more fun than my chapters. They were just more interesting, more compelling. And there was a very clear reason for it, which is that when you start reading a field note, you don't know by the beginning of the field note what's going to happen at the end. Whereas if I tell you in a chapter, oh, this chapter is going to be about something, that basic act of classification already gives away the end. So I ended up, doing reading about creative writing, and it seems that there seems to be a case that even in the field of literature, fiction, there's been a turn away from the plot and into the style of writing. But there are equally lots of voices that now call for bringing the plot back. So the one threading element that connected all the observations that I made was that I was there. And so this is why I ended up deciding that to give the book a plot, I had to put myself in it. But I appreciate that someone might come in and decide that this is just really a glorified brochure for the consulting services of Daniel, to which I would say that perhaps it is, and if it is, it may not be a bad thing. I was personally surprised that the Banking Standards Board contacted me for the purpose of training executives in banks in ethnographic methods. And I'm still grappling with the implications of that. This has been a very successful initiative. I repeated it last year for the with a particular focus in diversity and inclusion. And I am now doing it again at a different, now for a specific bank. But now I am doing it for a new team that didn't exist 5 years ago, which is the culture team. So the situation is getting even more meta, that now I am training in ethnography executives whose official position is head of culture. And again, that deserves further analysis. And it's just a pity that sometimes in the doing, one lacks the time to, in parallel, reflect on it. But I know that you know this and that we both share that frustration. And then this brings me back. This brings me to Michael and Michael's extremely generous comments. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be colleagues with Michael for 8 years, no less, at LSE. And yes, we had many conversations. And as you rightly point out, one hidden motivation for my study was the realization, shocking for me back in 2006, that my management students at MBA, in the MBA program at Columbia Business School, had no particular interest to learn about management. And that instead they much prefer to think of themselves as somehow in the ethos of the disruption that the financial markets often create in the corporate world via mergers and acquisitions, or more recently, private equity. And so, you know, a lot of my thinking has gone into trying to understand that desire to not be the responsible person in a gray suit. Why is it that maybe 50 years ago, 40 years ago, that seemed to be, you know, the primary wish of an MBA student, and now they don't want to be seen doing that? And so, as Michael points out, that is partly beyond me, but I think I agree with you that we need to rethink how management students are taught to provide a better form of appreciation. And I think part of it, as you rightly point out too, is being as bold and as confident as our finance colleagues are, and dare to teach them theory so that they are provided with structure based on a body of knowledge management that allows them to interpret the world just as they have one to interpret the world through the lens of economics. So I will leave it at that, and I would like to thank again all 4 panelists. This has been extremely interesting and thought-provoking to me, and I look forward to hear comments from the rest of the room.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And okay, now that we can open the debate, and if there are questions coming from the audience, it's time to raise your hands. Or I see Michael with a, okay, it's a reaction, okay. And we have David Lubin that wants to ask a question or not. Maybe, no, it's not the reaction. Maybe I have a question just to break the ice, probably. And maybe maybe you have to forgive me, it's a very naive question, probably coming from a philosopher. And so I was wondering, reading the book, if you have an opinion about the way the 3 ingredients of your book, morals, models, and management, should interact or align in order to avoid or mitigate adverse events like crisis or crashes. I mean, maybe that's a question coming from a regulative viewpoint, in the sense that what we can learn from your experiment about the way these 3 ingredients in the floor should interact in order to avoid certain adverse events like crashes and crisis.
Well, thank you, Emiliano. That is the question that everybody must have on their mind at the moment they see the title of my book. But funnily enough, this is the first time that somebody asks this extremely clear and at the same time profound question. So thank you for that. So I would say that the core lesson from my book echoes the theme of this year's Academy of Management meeting. So the meeting of the global academics of management, which takes place every year in the US or Canada. And this year, which was of course online, the theme was bring back the manager. And so it was the realization that even management academics had forgotten about the manager and what are the challenges of the manager and what are the goals of the manager and what are the skills of the manager. And this is even before the models were in the picture. So now we have models, and the classic, in my view, mistake is to think that the problem with the models is that, look, the map is not the territory. It oversimplifies, it misses detail, there might be biases. What I found, and this echoes that what Donald found in the terrain of a different type of model, the Gaussian copula, is that models are used both for evaluating the value of a security and for controlling others. And that it's the second part that is particularly damning when it comes to morality. So overall, my point would be that models have so far been introduced as a way to remove the need for management or to economize on management, or because those at the top didn't quite trust what the middle managers were doing, or maybe because the organization was just too big and it had grown too big for that process to take place. And instead, what it calls for is to bring back the management and not let the models be the ones who are determining what the models are. What the practices are in the organization. Because if you do that, you can easily run into problems such as moral disengagement. So a bit of a long answer, but thank you, Emiliano, for your question.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's very stimulating. And I see that Michael wants to ask a question. So thank you, Michael.
Well, it's really a short comment, and so I think one of the issues you face in this kind of thing is sometimes you want to do bold statements, broad brush, remember statements that you can remember easily, like there's a lesson to be drawn, managers are important. Models are not important without managers. That's fine. And that gets you into the right, ballpark. But in this book, there's a lot more than that. Okay, I draw your attention to page 104, which I had reread this afternoon. And there, these issues are dealt with, but on a kind of meso-micro scale relative to the lesson drawing I just referred to. Okay, this has to do with the conversation with Lewis and looking at what managers were doing. And what made them effective or not effective relative to what was required of people in the situation under Bob's regime, right? And I just suggest that this to me is the best kind of analysis of the book. What does it involve? It involves stating what are dilemmas. Okay, that's the term used here. Okay, dilemmas that were faced by the individuals given the roles that they came to occupy, and now let's not overly baboonize that, occupy because there was a construct that was operating through Bob's relationship to the organization. But okay, fine. But there was in the situation, there were dilemmas faced by this person, and resolution of them came in the form of patterns of visible symbolic action. Okay, and that and the dilemma, nature of the dilemma is reflected the nature of the business and not just the nature of bureaucracy. It's both. The source of the dilemma conceptually came from both bureaucracy and the business. Okay? And he goes on to talk about something that he calls a dilemma, but it might be seen in another slightly different tradition as a contradiction. Antithetical necessities, okay, for which there is no obvious solution, and there's certainly no theoretical solution. And this has to do with the paradoxical need for both distance and proximity, again, coming from the nature of the business and the nature of the organization, both. Okay, so I keep emphasizing nature of the business and the nature of the organization, because that's what management schools tend to leave out. Okay, they generalize about organizations and talk about them as if the details only matter casuistically in some sense. But actually, it really matters to talk about the business in relationship to the organization. And here, there's no simple lesson, okay? Okay, there's an understanding of the way everything in this situation works to in such a way that somebody in practice needs to recognize the antithetical necessities in the situation. And what's the lesson? There's no lesson, but there's an idea of what could, a concrete idea of what resolved it, okay? Moving the whiteboard relative to where the guy sits, okay? And that is a design solution for this problem. Now, its relevance to larger discussions of management need to be worked out. That requires a different storyline about the field of management than either the medical model of the modern management school or the casuistical Harvard one. And so I think there are things in Daniel's book that even Daniel doesn't fully appreciate yet, but will.
Thank you so much, Michael. This is brilliant, and I took good note of it. Emiliano, I don't want to jump into your role as moderator, but I am mindful of the time. What would you suggest if we are to close at 5:30? Should we have a round of questions?
I see two other questions coming from Yali, and I can see the name of University Co-work Zoom. Who is?
It must be David. Yeah, that's David.
That's David. Okay, so maybe we can listen to the questions and then you can answer to. Okay.
Oops. Let me start. I mean, what a wonderful book to elicit such diverse and insightful interpretations. And congratulations again to Daniel on this achievement. And I wonder, what where you see us as being at the moment. You mentioned control as being something that's at your interests as you look back at the book at this moment. We've mentioned ethics and morality, and I wonder whether you feel that there is a shift towards the understanding the question whether the models that we use in finance or accounting, for example, might, in the way that they orient towards different stakeholders or the different ways in which we might set standards in relation to these different models or standards, have implications for distribution implications maybe that are associated with control. And maybe, this is now going to Donald's comment about the ethnography of baboons. Donald, when you mentioned this, I thought if maybe agency theory is the parallel to the ethnography of baboons, in the sense that we feel that we control what we have greatest transparency regarding, what we know best. And I just wonder whether in considering these questions of control, and scope of the analysis, and you bringing ethics in as again. You know, how do you see models, morality, and control, and the scope of your analysis progressing in the future? That's my question, and congratulations again.
Thank you, Yali. Should we get David's question as well? And then
Yeah, okay.
Sure. Well, it's great to see everybody. And Daniel, congratulations on this book. I'm so happy to finally get it and read it and enjoy it. And I know, I've been able to witness part of your journey, the latter part, and it's been amazing to see what you've been able to put together with this final piece of work. So thank you for doing that, and congratulations on it. There were a couple of items that I wanted to ask. I guess my first question is, what is the impact on innovation? And it kind of struck me during this conversation that, you've got some aspects of culture. Of course, you've got performativity, which is really important. But I guess when I've thought about bankers and I've seen these fancy trading floors, I never really thought of GE or Westinghouse or your dad's corporation with a big, with a brown or blue suit. And it's interesting when you juxtapose this site against billions, if you will, that this is the old way of doing things in many ways. And in some ways, but in other ways, it's got hybridity, it's got DEI, it's got access to capital, it's got some power relations. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts in terms of, the implications of what you've written for these people that are taking these management courses and only want to be consultants or whatnot, as opposed to thinking about moving literally billions and trillions of dollars? What are the implications on innovation? Like, is this the old stuff and is this going away? Or do you see this in these performativity spirals as something that could lead to something new and greater, and this might be the site of innovation? So I was just curious about that.
Great, thank you so much. It's a very important question as well. So what I will try and do, Emiliano, is give a quick answer, and hopefully there might be occasions to have, if not a face-to-face coffee, a digital coffee with both Yali and David. So Yali's question is about where do we stand now in terms of the models that are guiding control. And I would say that we are standing at the site of a fascinating, possibly performative experiment, which is to replace agency theory and the idea that it's all about the shareholder with a form of stakeholders theory, in which now the goal is a completely different one, and it's about attending to other stakeholders because the financial system itself has updated its approaches at valuing companies and is pushing companies to do that. There is no telling how this massive experiment is going to end, and whether it is an exercise in greenwashing or instead whether it is something that is addressing the world's problems. But what I can say is that the world is doubling down on this path as it now is seeking to, through international institutions such as the UN, effectively bring finance and climate together. And this is the point number, the third goal of the COP26 that is taking place in 3 weeks. And the way in which this is happening is through the use of risk models. So, the fascinating aspect of following the current debates on the climate emergency is that it is replaying in many ways some of these debates about the interplay between the economics and the models and the political consequences or the moral consequences. So that question was spot on. And by the way, I'm taking off for Glasgow in 3 weeks. The question by David on the impact of innovation. again, it's a very important question. And, you know, I always thought of myself as a proud member of the Center for Organizational Innovation at Columbia, to be a car-carrying pro-innovation citizen. But to my surprise, what I found is that when it comes to not just innovation in general, but specifically financial innovation in the sight of the large banks on Wall Street ended up playing out in many ways as attempts to circumvent the existing rules. And so you find new practices that are not explicitly prohibited by the existing rules and regulations. And just a wonderful research by Dan Hirschman on how the development of over-the-counter derivatives was a way to circumvent Glass-Steagall. So, so I guess that here, how I came out after my book is slightly more skeptical about innovation, mindful of its benefits, yes. And by the way, a lot of the financial innovation that we had up until the 2000s came out of a single institution, Solomon Brothers. But at the same time, I'm mindful that it can have some unexpected, unintended consequences. And so I guess that there's a debate to be had along those lines.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. And I don't see other questions. So maybe if there are somebody that wants to ask questions, now it's time. So I don't see hands. Okay.
So maybe this is a good time to let people get back to their
their jobs. So thank you very much again, Daniel, and all the discussants and the participants, and thank you very much for giving life to the Phinance online seminars. And I hope that.
Apologies, I think that there's a question there from Eric. Oh no, it's
yeah.
I think it's not a question.
No, it's not a question. It's just I want to thank you all for excellent seminar, for the invitation, sending this out. Social Studies and Finance Network. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Well, I have another. Can I make another comment? Another comment on the lines of ethnography, geography, and spatial networks. I mean, the first Copernican revolution that we had related to space and time, where, we began to think of space and time as necessarily frames that we apply to the world. And then sociology came along and said, maybe we should think of our social structures as, enabling ways of understanding the world. And I'm just wondering whether ethnography can lead us to a situation where we have another shift in the way that we understand the role of the ethno, the role of the human in society, in the world, and if so, in what ways that can ethnography lead us to achieve that aim? I mean, there's ethnomethodology, of course, which is in that kind of tradition. And I just wonder if we're going to, encouraging a comment along these lines of, how can we take the next step, do you think, in terms of studies of the human and organizationally, how we understand organizations, and how might finance play a role in our understanding of our condition in such a way? I think Daniel's book is a contribution to a debate along these lines, and that's a major achievement, I think, in this respect. And it touches on what Donald and Michael have been talking about in our conversation about new ways of doing management and understanding management. So that's really a comment rather than a question, but trying to tease out some of the, how much I enjoyed this seminar.
Thank you. We also have, maybe there is Jose who wants to ask a question.
Yeah, just a kind of quick thing is a bit of a response to what Daniel was. So I just want to clarify that I didn't want to be cynical about the book, as you mentioned. I know that teasing as a brochure for your practice, but I think there is something in the story here, and I really like the way the book is written, actually, so it's not a complaint about that. I think there is something that also Michael pointed out is in the story of you beginning your problem as a teacher of management, and maybe this book is not only a book of an innovation in terms of how to study these managers of finance, but also of you developing a way to speak to practice. And maybe there is something that we don't do too often. And normally when we think about the history of organization theory, we think them as a kind of succession of theories. But I think we could also think the history of organization theory in terms of how different ways of inventing a relationship between academic research and practice. And I think what might be at stake in your more recent work is a test of a different way of speaking to practice, and in that sense, a solution to your problem of how to talk to practitioners. So it's not only about ethnography as a method to study practitioners, but also as a way of working with practitioners. And I think the book is not about that story. As you say, like there has not been yet time to write that story, but I think there is a germ in the book that we see the process in which you seem to be developing this original way to speak or collaborating with financial practitioners that I think is very, very original. And normally we tend to see it cynically from academic because it's seen as a kind of consultancy or practitioner oriented. But I think as we do innovation in terms of new theories, there is a academic innovation that is creating new way to relate to practice. And I think the book and your work might be working in that interface in a way.
Thank you so much, Jose. And I also see that Michael probably showed his book as an example of that similar level of engagement with practice, and I take it as a compliment. And I didn't mean in no way, the coming brochure, it would be a terrible brochure. It's just too long as a brochure. But I take your point. I guess I was dramatizing your own point before. I agree. I think that this needs to be further explored, and hopefully we'll have the chance to have more conversations.
I'll just add that, what I think you invented was literature. And the literary aspect of the book is what makes it work. Okay, it couldn't have been done otherwise, and I think your reader understands that. So there's no way that you could be taken as using the book in a self-aggrandizing way. Okay? And that, I think, for us, and maybe for philosophers of sciences, why is it that this innovation in the study of organizations and management required a literary treatment? And
that's a fair
point. There's a very complex answer to that. Part of it has to do with the way people respond to argument, but also there was no other place to stand for what you were trying to do.
Yeah, and I might add there, I think that time is so essential to the book that there's a sense in which the book had to be told as a story, and that's of course what gives it its readability, that even a reader who may not be entirely familiar with the theoretical apparatus or with the substantive nature of finance gets drawn in by the story of somebody coming from the outside, becoming, as it were, familiar with the culture, but then later on standing back, re-engaging and rethinking what the younger Daniel thought. And I think that narrative arc to the book is very important.
But it also makes it an outlier of a study, and therefore it's always difficult to know what is the word, or what you want to say about a work that worked for you because of its outlier characteristics when you're trying to tell others about it. It seems to me that's what this seminar has pointed to, both as being important and very hard.
Well, thanks again, Michael and Donald. Thank you all. And I suppose this may be a great place to conclude. So once again, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Emiliano, for once again bringing us together.
It's a pleasure. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.